This Thursday, New Yorkers elected somebody called Bill de Blasio as their mayor. There are some very interesting things about the campaign that he ran. It's interesting, actually, I like to say this as an aside, that he is married to a black woman and has 2 mixed-race children. Some of you will say, what's so interesting about that? As late as 1967, it was illegal in almost all the American southern states to have a mixed-race marriage. So the fact that he could do it and run successfully for mayor was interesting. But the really important point about Bill de Blasio's election was the platform on which he ran. He talked about more affordable housing, he talked about rent control, he talked about opposition to New York's version of stop and search, stop and frisk, they call it there. He was the only mayoral candidate who took on stop and frisk and talked about the disproportionate effect on BME young people. Even the black candidate in the Democratic primary chose to side with the police on stop and search because, you know, just as here, it's very popular with the police, very popular with a lot of people, but Bill de Blasio took it on. But finally, and perhaps this is the most important thing, he attacked the growing inequality in New York City. He talked about how it was a tale of 2 cities. He talked about how there were hundreds of thousands of billionaires, but over 40% people in poverty. But he also said he was going to put up taxes on the wealthy to spend on education and preschool childcare. And do you know, Bill de Blasio won by a landslide. A landslide. He is the first Democratic mayor in New York City for 20 years. So what does that tell us? He wasn't the Democratic Party's chosen candidate, but he smashed her in the primary. He was coming from a left, in American terms, a left of centre position, and yet he won in every single demographic in New York. Amongst the middle classes, white, Hispanic, blacks, LGBT, he won in every single demographic by a landslide. I think he got 70% of the vote. And I think what that tells us is that despite what the Democratic Party establishment or the Labour Party establishment would say, people want a different message. They can see the savagery and unfairness of austerity. They can see the savagery and unfairness of the growing divide between the rich and poor. And I think, obviously New York is different, London is different and so on, but I think people want to hear a different message on austerity if people have the courage and the boldness to put it forward. The other thing that it's important to say about austerity, although we all know it really, you know, the Tories say we're having to implement this austerity because of the financial crash, because of Labour mismanagement, because. They're implementing austerity because they have long wanted to slash the welfare state. They have long wanted to smash the achievements of the 1945 Labour government. They're not doing it when it comes down to it because they have to. They're doing it because they want to. When you sit on outside of the chamber and see the serried ranks of the 2010 intake, these are the children of Thatcherism. They despise the welfare state, whether it's the NHS, whether it's welfare, whether it's social housing, they despise it. And they are not making a few cuts, which they might reverse when times get better. They are taking down the welfare state, taking down the NHS, taking down our benefit system as far as they're concerned for all time. And that is why it's so important to fight this austerity. It's not something that will last for a government. If it's not opposed, we will see the achievements of 1945, the welfare state, the health service, the benefit system, social housing, we will see them removed and not come back for our children and our grandchildren. So the Tories want austerity. I was in Parliament in 2010 for George Osborne's first budget, and he announced this budget, he announced these big cuts in the public sector. And the Tories were ecstatic. Ecstatic. They looked, if you sit there and look, they were ecstatic. The Lib Dems, I might say, looked like someone had shot their dog, like their dog had died. Because they understood what Osborne was saying. But the Tories were ecstatic. They want to do it, they don't have to do it. And the other thing to say, and again, we all know it really, those people in the Labour movement who claim there is no alternative to austerity, that we've got to be sensible, we've got to be chill, we've got to offer these cuts, they are precisely the people in society who are not suffering from austerity. Who is suffering from austerity in Hackney? Women workers, black and minority ethnic workers, the working class Unite members, the people, I tell you, there's never any question. You see someone stand up, a Labour Party MP or some Labour Party spin doctor, and tell us, oh no, we've got to be sensible, we've got to accept a measure of austerity. You will know these are not people that in their lives or in their families are feeling the effects of austerity. So, we have to fight austerity. We have to reach out to working men and women, because women are predominantly suffering from the cuts in the public sector. We need to reach out and keep our MPs on the right side on this issue. We need to raise the issue in our CLPs. We need to raise the issue on the NEC, and I can see an NEC member sitting there. We need to raise the issue in whatever corner of the Labour movement we find ourselves. And just a word on fighting austerity in London. Jeremy has spoken about the importance of rent control and a big social housing programme. Many of you will have no memory of the era in the 1950s when a Tory Prime Minister, Hal Macmillan, could boast about how many houses we were going to build. Because it was assumed in the 1950s that any government, not just Labour or Tory, but any government would want to build houses for its people. It's come to something now when Harold Macmillan in the 1950s could boast about the hundreds of thousands of houses, council houses, I'm telling you, council houses, Tory boasted about it, that the leadership of the Labour Party is frightened to talk about building social housing, hundreds of thousands of social housing. We must turn that debate around. But there are other things that as a party in London, in our programme for the mayoral election, we can do to fight austerity. We need to look at the issue of fares. For many people, particularly younger people and working people, fares are a huge cost on them, and Labour ought to be looking at cutting fares, and we also need to look at the implementation of the living wage. Not just people that are employed directly by the GLA, but everybody that gets a contract from the GLA ought to be paying the living wage, otherwise they shouldn't get. It was called, it was one of the policies that Ken implemented when he was through the GLC. It was called contract compliance, and I think it's due for a revival. So, we're here because we want Labour to win in 2015. But I tell you, we will not win in 2015 unless we examine, my chair's maybe 2 minutes now, wind up. We won't win in 2015 unless we examine the course down which we're going. Jeremy talked about the limitations of our pledge on energy. We will not win in 2015. Anyone heard me say it before? We will not win in 2015 by moving to the right on immigration. I always say this, but I think it's important to keep saying it. Immigrants do not cause low wages, weakened unions, a liberalised labour market, and predatory employers cause low wages. But we will not win in 2015 above all unless we offer an alternative to austerity. That is what ordinary people want. It's no good telling them there is no alternative. Across the Atlantic in New York, ordinary people decided for themselves. Whatever the democratic establishment said, we want an alternative. We want a leader in our city that will talk about equality, that will talk about the super rich, that is prepared to tax the super rich. Ed Miliband went the right way, ultimately, on Syria, with a little nudge. We need to give him more than a little nudge on austerity. Not offering an alternative to austerity the right thing to do, it is the only way we will win outright the election in 2015.